Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really zooming in on just one source.
That's great.
It's a transcript excerpt from a YouTube video, and the title is, well, quite provocative. Why left-wing art looks so mentally ill. So our mission here, just to be crystal clear, is simply to unpack the arguments within this specific text.
Exactly. We're looking at the viewpoint it presents, nothing more.
No outside info, no taking sides. We just want to understand what this source is saying.
And it definitely makes some striking claims right off the bat about art it connects with the political left.
It certainly does. So what's the central question this source is tackling?
Well, it asks directly, why does what it calls left-wing art often look, and these are its words, mentally ill or childlike, sometimes even intellectually disabled?
That's jarring phrasing, but it's crucial we stick to what the source actually says. So what observations does it make initially about this art? What leads it to use those terms?
The source describes seeing a common style, something it claims pops up frequently. It says this art often shares similar themes, uses certain color designs, frequently has misshapen faces,
Right.
and just generally has this uncanny quality is the word. It suggests it can almost feel mass-produced in that specific way.
And does it offer a counterpoint? How does it contrast that?
Yeah, it draws a contrast with art it associates with the political right.
Okay.
The source claims that art from people it identifies as right-wing often looks more, polished or shows a higher level of technical skill.
And specifically lacks that other quality.
Right. It claims it lacks that appearance. The source labels intellectually disabled. Now, the source does state up front that, the art world is generally dominated by people higher in openness, creativity.
Traits, it links more to the left.
Exactly. Traits, it says, tend to be more left-wing. But its main focus, the question it's really digging into, is why this particular style it's describing seems so, abundant within the art it identifies as left.
Okay, so it sees this specific style, acknowledges the broader context, but zeroes in on why so much of this. Where does it go from there for an explanation?
It suggests the answer lies in philosophy. It tries to connect this art style to a particular philosophical viewpoint about art itself.
Interesting.
Suggesting it might show maybe a lack of self-awareness tied to that philosophy.
And what philosophy is that, according to the source?
The source argues that this perceived abundance of, and again, this is its term, shitty art.
Right, quoting the source there.
Comes from a belief it associates with the left. The idea that there's no objective good or bad in art, it's all just subjective preference.
So the idea that you can't really say one piece is better than another objectively.
According to the source's description of this viewpoint, it's all just...
And how does the source claim that belief affects the artist? What's the consequence?
Well, the source suggests that if an artist truly believes there's no objective standard, then they lose a certain kind of shame about what they create. They can't really look at their own work and think, okay, this is just plain hot garbage.
Again, the source's words.
Yes. From that philosophical standpoint, as the source presents it, their own little doodle isn't objectively worse or better than, say, a Michelangelo painting.
Even accounting for skill or time.
Right. The source acknowledges differences in skill or effort, but argues the fundamental value is seen as equivalent in this subject.
So the core idea here, as the source sees it, is that ditching objective quality removes a kind of internal editor for the artist.
Exactly that. The source argues the subjective stance actually kills motivation and growth.
How so?
Because the contrast it draws is with someone who does believe in objective good and bad art.
Okay.
That belief, according to the source, gives you a much stronger reason to, practice, develop skills.
Right, to strive for something.
Yes, and importantly, it makes you less likely to show off your early mistakes or what the source calls trash, because you recognize it as trash relative to some standard.
Okay, that's one major strand of the argument.
Right.
But the source also looks beyond the creation process, right? It looks at how this art gets shared online.
It does, yeah. It observes how people share this type of art, often very openly, online.
And how does the source interpret that sharing?
It interprets it as shamelessly seeking validation. That's the phrase.
But it also points out a kind of contradiction there.
Yes, it highlights this dynamic where, okay, the artists are looking for praise, but then, according to the source, They get mad at you if you're honest and offer constructive criticism.
Even mild suggestions.
Even just suggesting, some things you could have done better.
And the source has a pretty strong take on that reaction, that rejection of criticism.
Oh, definitely. It labels that behavior delusional.
Delusional what?
Its argument is basically, look, if you put your work out there asking for positive feedback, you're implicitly opening yourself up to all feedback, including critical thoughts.
Logically, yeah.
So rejecting criticism while seeking praise is framed as wanting only compliment me. And the source just calls that an insane position that wouldn't fly in almost any other area of life.
Okay. Then the source broadens the scope a bit, connecting this art discussion to a wider philosophical idea about beauty itself.
It does. It claims this whole art situation is tied directly to the philosophy that beauty is subjective.
And how does it frame that?
It links it to the idea that, everybody is beautiful, everybody is a 10.
And the source's view on that particular philosophy?
It's quite direct. It calls the idea bullshit and demonstrably false.
No mincing words there.
None at all. It sees this whole subjective beauty, everyone's a 10 thing, as basically an attempt to equalize beauty just by declaring it so, regardless of reality.
Does the source offer a reason why people might push that idea if it thinks it's false?
Yes, it suggests it's not really about honesty regarding beauty itself.
Okay.
Instead, the source interprets it as more of an act of charity, or maybe just kindness, trying to make people feel good about themselves.
And by extension, about their art.
And about the art they make, exactly. The source flat out says it believes people who claim beauty is subjective don't believe the things they say.
Wow.
Yeah, it argues they're just using the phrase as like encouragement or a kind gesture. Okay, so let's try and synthesize this. The source's argument, boring it down, seems to be embracing subjective art, no good, no bad, makes it easier to churn out what it calls shitty crayon drawings.
Right. That's the term it keeps using.
And why? Because in the source's view, you can show this stuff off, expect praise, maybe even imply it's on the same level as Michelangelo's statue.
Without the years of hard work and skill development.
Exactly, because those objective standards of skill and quality have been dismissed, according to this philosophy, as the source presents it.
And the source sees a really negative consequence stemming from all this.
A very significant one. It concludes this whole mindset breeds mental illness.
That's a huge claim.
It is. It leads to what it calls delusional people. Delusional about themselves, their art, their work.
How does the source define delusion in this context? What does it mean by that?
It defines it essentially as not seeing reality for what it is.
Okay.
The specific example it uses is believing that two vastly different pieces of art, one showing clear technical mastery, the other, well, not, are somehow just as beautiful or just as amazing.
And that belief is what the source labels
delusional and insane or mentally ill. And it goes further to claim this is a state that the left is breeding.
Wow. And just to reiterate the contrast the source draws, with individuals it identifies on the right.
The source suggests those individuals produce less of what it sees as trash because they understand the difference between, say, practice exercises and finished art.
They know when something isn't ready or isn't good.
According to the source, yes. They know when they make trash because they see it as part of skill development aimed at an objective standard. Whereas the opposing view, as the source portrays it, is that any little shit they take on the canvas, that's a piece of art right there. And the source does wrap up by circling back to its initial point.
The clarification.
It stresses it's not saying all art from the left way. Absolutely not. But its argument, laid out in this transcript, is that this philosophical viewpoint it's described explains.
The abundance.
Yes, explains why there are so many people who have this exact same uncanny, weird art style that looks intellectually stunted, using its examples of looking like it was made by a child or someone mentally impaired.
Okay. So quite a detailed argument laid out by the source there. Let's bring this back to you, the listener. We've just spent time unpacking this one specific viewpoint from this single piece of material.
Right. And it's important to remember it is one author's specific lens, their interpretation of what they're saying.
So you might want to reflect on the claims the source itself makes. Think about the connections it draws between these philosophical ideas, its take on subjectivity versus objectivity in art and beauty, and how the source argues these ideas impact things like self-awareness, the drive to get better, how criticism is handled.
And ultimately, how the source believes these factors show up in the actual art being.
Understanding this perspective is really about understanding how this particular source's author constructs their argument. And interprets the things they're discussing.
It's about seeing the logic within that specific point.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this specific source.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, stemming directly from the source's own line of if, and this is a big if based entirely on the source's argument, if dismissing objective standards in art does remove the drive for skill development and shield artists from criticism, there's no common ground, does that necessarily hinder artistic progress or lead to a disconnect from craftsmanship, as this specific source contends?
Or, stepping back from the source, are there perhaps entirely different ways to interpret the motivations, the processes, and the outcomes related to the art styles this source is discussing?
Something to consider as you reflect on the arguments presented in this material.